All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Jinhua Zhao, Professor of Cities and Transportation at MIT. This is the MIT Mobility Forum organized by the MIT Mobility Initiative. Today, I'm really glad to have Professor Eric Miller join us, presenting his research on cities, mobility, and complexity in the post-pandemic world. In 1958, Professor Colin Clark wrote an article on the journal Town Planning Review titled Transport, the Maker and Breakers of Cities. It's interesting to see that that's 70 years ago. He recognized both the major contribution that transportation can do to the city, but also many of these negative potential impact upon cities, right? So the role of transportation in shaping city has been the central theme of many of our city planners, transportation engineers, right? I would say there's no better person than Professor F. Miller to really give a talk about both the historical view on this, but also what's the modern discussion in this respect. Professor Eric Miller is a pioneer of the agent-based micro-simulation model system in large urban context. He developed this integrated transportation and land use models that permits the analysis of the two-way interaction between transportation system and urban form. In particular, he developed the GTA model. It's an advanced regional travel demand modeling system used by many municipalities in the Greater Toronto Area, GTA, to forecast travel demand. It's based on the state-of-the-art agent-based micro-simulation model of activity and travel, as well as an integrated land use and transportation model system for the GTA. Professor Miller directs the University of Toronto Transportation Research Institute. He chaired the U.S. Transportation Research Board Committee on Travel Behavior and Values. He also chaired the International Association for Travel Behavior Research. He received the Wilbur Smith Distinguished Educator Award from the Institute of Transportation Engineers, and the inaugural winner of the University of British Columbia Marvelous National Design for Living Award. By the way, at that time, I was a professor at the UBC. I really enjoyed the speech Professor Miller gave at this inaugural session there. And he also received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the IATBR. So before I pass the forum to Eric, I just want to warm up the audience a little bit by having two polls to understand people's ownership. This is the first question I just launched to get a sense of the travel behavior of our own audience here. All right, 120 people already participated. I'll give 5 more seconds. Miss. Okay, I will end the poll and share the result. Hopefully you can see that about 32% 0 cars, 36 1 car, 25 2 cars, 7 3 cars, and there is people have more than 4 cars or more. Right, that's the first one. Yeah. The second one we get is on public transit. Let's get this relaunch poll. It's about how often you use public transit. Right. See. All right, 160 people participated. Let me close the poll now and then share the result. 40% people are very frequent users, 3 days a week more than 25, 1 or 2, 40% 1 day a month, and 20% not much, right? Hopefully, Eric, this gives you some background of this audience travel behavior to look at car and transit as the two major drivers here, right? So just lastly, let me reinforce the norm of this forum, which is every audience contribute one idea. Yeah, please do type into the chat either a question for Professor Miller or a comment to the presentation, right? Without further ado, let me pass the forum to Professor Miller. Eric, it's yours.
Well, thank you very much, Jinhua, and thank you so much for invite you personally and the Mobility Forum inviting me here today. It's a real honor, especially as a MIT alumnus, to be able to have a chance to talk today and talk about something that I've been thinking about for a long time. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. Hopefully everybody can see
Yes.
my screen. So the agenda for today, I want to start by talking about cities as complex systems. And, Genoa, you mentioned the paper from 1958. Well, James Jacobs in 1960, in the famous Death and Life of Great American Cities, said cities were problems in organized complexity. And I think lots of people have been trying to parse that and think about what that means ever since. And about a decade later, Ritter and Weber talked about cities as being a wicked problem. And I think that's true today. And I'm not going to solve that wicked problem today, but we're going to try to wrestle with it a bit. So having introduced a bit of notion about complexity, I do want to talk about cities and transport, starting with, very briefly, a historical view, but moving very quickly to the present day, but talking about how that history is with us today. And I'm going to try to tie that to a concept of in complexity, the notion of attractors. But then I do want to, we've been disrupting our cities, our transportation networks for some time, even before COVID. And then, of course, we have to understand how is the status quo being shaken up by both technology and other events like the pandemic. And I will conclude with some implications, I think, for change and future issues of future sustainability. So I think with this audience, probably I'm preaching to the converted. I think we all, if we are working in the urban sphere, the transportation sphere, I think we understand that cities are systems of systems. And what we mean by that is that there are many systems. Probably most of the people on the call today are transportation people of some sort, but there are many technical systems, physical systems, information, energy, and so on. But the city is also an economic engine. It's an economic system. It's a social system. It's a political system. And so it is this complex interplay that makes cities so fascinating, but also what makes them wicked problems and difficult to deal with. Today, obviously, I'm going to be focusing on transportation and information and how these interplay within this complex system. But I think we also have to recognize that the city exists within a biological world as well as a physical world, and the interconnections with those larger systems we ignore at our peril. So really elaborate on this notion of cities as being a complex system, I think it's important to highlight that specifically or particularly they are massive social networks. And indeed, one could argue, and certain researchers like Jeffrey West and Luis Betancourt have argued that, essentially we build cities to create a social network. We build cities so that we can interact, again, economically, socially, culturally, politically. And there is an emerging science of cities led by people like Luis and Jeffrey West, but Mike Batty and many others. We're trying to explore if the science of cities. Are there fundamental principles that underlie the way cities work, almost regardless of form or location, and so forth. And in particular, some there's been a lot of really interesting work over the last 15 plus years looking at what's known as the scaling of cities. That as cities grow large, because they're social networks and because the interactions grow exponentially, geometrically, larger cities are more productive. They're wealthier. They're also have more crime and more disease, and so they have more of anything. So economists talk about agglomeration effects. The agglomeration effects of coming together and interacting really fundamentally, I think, has to do with this notion of social networks. The more of us there are together, the more we interact, the more creative we are, and so on and so forth. So I think that's extremely important. And I guess another way of talking about this in terms of also this notion of complexity is, as with any system, really, cities are massive feedback loops, and it's these particularly positive reinforcing feedbacks within our economy and with each other and our technology that grows wealth and grows information and so forth. And so we have to understand, at the end of the day, we have to understand those feedback loops, because ultimately the structure of the city or any system has to do with how are the parts interacting, how is information flowing, how does an action here create an action someplace else. So moving directly to transportation, transportation has been fundamental to the growth of cities. Cities could not exist without, a transportation system. And so over in the long run, the how we build the transportation system and what the technology and capabilities of that system are influences very directly our urban form and how the city functions. So the structure of cities has and how those cities have functioned have always been driven directly by transportation. So there's a very strong connection between how we build a city and how transportation literally gives us a spatial definition that makes land accessible and hence makes it useful. So the relationship between urban activity and transport systems is what I would fundamentally call transportation 101. The picture in the lower left corner is Professor Marvin Mannheim, one of my professors at MIT. For me, he's the father of transportation systems analysis in many respects. But many others, of course, have contributed to this. The basic point of this, and to a certain extent, the basic point of my talk is we can't look at the transportation system in isolation. We have to look at it as a mediating technology within the urban system. If we want to understand how we should be designing transportation systems, how systems are used, and how they perform, we have to understand them within the context of the larger city. The larger city, on the other hand, its form, its function, the location choices of developers and firms and households are fundamentally, again, influenced by the accessibility, the capabilities of the transportation system as evolved. So, I often tell my students that once the land use is set, everything else is quote unquote just traffic engineering. You can flip that around and say, I think, urban design is also traffic engineering. That how we build the city and how we build the transportation network, they're chickens and eggs. We have to consider them together. So, if having made those preliminary comments and saying transportation technology has always affected how we build cities. If we look back through history to the pre-industrial cities, going back to the dawn of cities, I mean, cities have been 5,000 years ago, or 5,000 BC, cities were starting to emerge in the Middle East and other places. So, cities are, Lewis Mumford called them the containers of civilization. Our civilization, our economy is fundamentally tied to cities. Even though through much of history, most people didn't live in cities, the cities have always dominated culture and so forth. But in any event, the pre-industrial city for millennia were small, dense, and extremely compact. A couple exceptions around the world, but generally cities were small. From transportation and largely because the transportation available, we walked. We had a horse cart, an ox to haul us around. Transportation was very inefficient, very, very expensive, very difficult, and it was a person-based. Basically, you owned a horse or you owned an ox cart. You walked, and so we kind of self-supplied. Other than somebody built some streets, we kind of self-supplied the transportation that we used every day, and it was very costly, very inefficient, and as a result, cities were very small. So I like to talk about different people divide things up slightly differently and so forth. But I think we agree that there was truly a revolution in transportation starting, in the 19th century when, with the Industrial Revolution and the invention of steam engines in the first instance and availability of steel rails and so forth, but then electrification, we mechanized transportation, and we were able to create mass transit, public transit, on a scale never seen before, and that translated directly into cities growing in size, magnitude as never before. And so the emergence of mega cities of 1 million or more, London, Paris, et cetera, was directly enabled by the transportation technology that was now available to us. I mean, the Industrial Revolution was also driving the need for larger populations to gather together to create a labor force, but transportation, the mechanized transportation, public transit, enabled this to happen and help shape growth. And so we see cities expanding. The first suburbs really occurred during this time. They were railway based, and so the city actually not only grew, but it actually de-densified a little bit. But the densities at that time were still much higher than what we're used to thinking about today. And so that revolution started in the 19th century, and hard on its heels, not that much later, in the early 20th century, we obviously had a second revolution, which was driven by the automobile. And notably, the first Model T, Ford Model T, that ran off the assembly line, I think, marks the start of the automobile era, when the automobile became a practical reality for vast numbers of people. And I think we're all familiar with, the cities we have today have largely been built based on the automobile. I mean, these trends did start, at least in the United States and a few other places, before World War II, but the Great Depression and then World War II kind of interrupted that. But, post World War II, we're all familiar with the expansion of the cities. And again, not just in North America, but around the world, that has been largely driven by access to the automobile. And this, again, returned us to more of a personal-based transportation system, in that, the appeal of the automobile, I've put free in quotes because nothing comes free, as we know, there's downsides, but it freed people from, having to, the fixed service public transit. They could go from A to B whenever they wanted. It also, on the land use side, in a sense, freed land use to spread out, sprawl, in a way that it was no longer constrained to be along the transit line or the transit station. So that's transportation, but I just want to step back just a little bit to the first thought about system of systems, is that another incredibly important technology and system we have is information communications technology. And just as transportation has evolved dramatically over the centuries and decades, so has telecommunications, starting with perhaps the telegraph and then the telephone and then radio and so on. And there's always been a very complex, complementary and competitive interaction between communications and travel. Obviously, we can substitute communications for travel. None of us traveled to attend this lecture today. We're using communication to gather together. So information technologies provide another form of accessibility. And so this trend has been going on. I mean, historically, I think it's been fairly clear. The more we can communicate with each other, the more we travel, particularly, let's say, internationally and so forth. But there's obviously a competition, a substitution effect going on. And certainly we've all experienced over the last few years with the pandemic, the explosion of online platforms such as we're using right now in order to interact. People have been talking about, this sort of technology since the 60s, but it's really only been the last few years, and partially, certainly driven, I would think, largely by the pandemic, that we are at the point now where we have information technology, which is really substituting or competing with transportation for interaction. And we'll come back to that. Okay, so getting back to sort of the systems theory kind of theme that's underlying this, in systems theory, and particularly complex system theory, it's well recognized that every system, whether it's just that first little diagram in the upper left is just a bowl, it's just a marble in a bowl, about as simple a system as you can get. The lower one is a weather pattern. Won't try to explain it. But every system has one or more attractors to which the system will tend to converge if left undisturbed. So if you throw a ball into a bowl, it'll roll around all sorts of different ways, but it's going to end up at the bottom of the bowl eventually if left undisturbed. That's the attractor in that very little system. The lower one, there's a couple of attractors which are, this is driving weather patterns. and there's obviously a much more complex system, but there is an underlying, no matter how complex the system is, there's an underlying structure to it, which ultimately, again, really has to do with the feedback loops and how different parts are interacting with each other. And so the number and location of attractors is largely dominated by its system structure, mainly feedback loops. And once an attractor is established, it can be very difficult to break free from. We very often have to rewire the system, change the feedback loops. Just tweaking a parameter will not fundamentally, typically, change what the attractor looks like. So what does that have to do with transportation in this talk? I would argue that every city in the world has one or more attractors in it. Because we've built a system, it's a massive feedback loop. It has an attractor. It has a type of performance, a type of behavior that is kind of wired into the city. And I would argue that both the pre-industrial and the transit or industrial cities, the attractor was one of centralization and concentration of activities and travel flows. The whole idea of central places and monocentric cities, the emergence of radial transit networks to feed high density, very, very dominant central places, evolution of intensive and mixed use of land along streetcar lines and so forth. Walkability is maintained even is very essential to the transit system. And trip lengths, because travel is still, somewhat restricted spatially and so forth. Trip length minimization tends to characterize, let's say, the 19th century city. The second attractor is obviously the automobile city that has emerged over the last 100 years. Very different in spatial terms: low density, dispersed population, extensive and often single use of land. Land is not used intensively as much. A very different, street grid network that facilitates many-to-many flows instead of many-to-one flows into that central area. The whole, in the 1980s, there was a famous book by Garreau called Edge Cities talking about the emergence of this new suburban structure. And of course, very high car dependency and typically very limited walkability. Have built things in a way that's very difficult to walk. And arguably the driving force is mobility maximization in many respects. So, both of these attractors exist, I would argue, in essentially all cities. The first attractor hasn't gone away. We still have transit systems in many cities, not all. We still have maybe a strong central business district. We have some walkable neighborhoods, but then we have a lot of car-oriented, lower density suburbs, and so on and so forth. And so I view most urban regions are two cities at least. The old city, the attractor one city that still has some density and transit orientation, and city two, which is the auto-oriented city. And these two attractors, these two urban forms and associated transportation systems constantly interact. They support each other to a certain extent, but they're also competing with one another. And I think if we look around the world, possibly we could categorize cities as which attractor is dominant and which one is more secondary. So certainly in the North American context, the auto attractor is usually dominant. But even there, in some of the older cities, the New Yorks, the Bostons, Chicagos of the world, there's still a very strong attractor one at work. If we then look at Asian cities, for example, or even European cities, attractor one is still maybe very strong in many cases, although there is still clearly, a suburban car culture that exists at the same time. And both of these work in the sense, and I think they're both supporting cities as social networks, but often in very different ways. And I'm just looking at the time, and I realize I'm taking way too long, so I'm going to try to skip through the next few slides very quickly. Clearly, we've been having a lot of disruption, and what's happening technologically. This theme of technology before COVID, and then COVID really messed things up in many ways. So we can list a whole bunch of different kinds of disruptions that have been in play in parallel and interacting with each other. Many of them are sort of outside transportation, maybe even outside city design per se. There are challenges to the status quo. Climate change is a huge challenge to us. increasingly we are more concerned than we used to be about equity. And just the sheer urbanization trend that's going on is a huge pressure on all of us. And then, of course, COVID came along and it massively disrupted everything. In particular, given this notion that the city is a social network, the only way before vaccines arrived that we could fight COVID was break the social networks. We stayed home. We didn't go to stores. We didn't, we broke the whole reason, we broke the city so that we could try to fight the disease. And now we're trying to build it back. So then with the question of technology, having said technology has always shaped cities, what's the role of new technologies and all the more artificial intelligence and everything else that's surrounding us these days? And there's a huge amount of discussion and action in terms of trying to exploit urban informatics. And some people think it's a brave new world. Some people think it's going to make things worse. But technology is going to make a huge play in cities. And the question is, how do we take advantage of technology? And certainly, technology has, we have new mobility services. We have the Ubers of the world. We have so we have lots of technologies and services we're all familiar with. Something I think maybe, at least in the crowd I hang out with, we don't pay as much attention to, but technology for a long time has been changing the way, we've been gradually improving our real-time controlled systems to get much better operational efficiency. I mean, that's going to continue, and it's I think it's a real trend. Again, maybe something we don't always talk about as much is all the ways information technology is changing travel behavior. I mean, we obviously know apps, Google Waze, whatever, telling you how to best, what's the best route. So route guidance apps, but even things like activity location choice. When I go to a city, the first thing I do is look up TripAdvisor and find out where the restaurants are. So I think travel behavior is being modified by the access to information, real-time access to information in ways that I suspect we haven't really been following as much as we should. So the question is, with all this technology running around, is it going to change it? Is it going to change fundamentally shift the attractors? Yes, technology is going to have an impact. It's changing things all the time, but will it actually create a different attractor or fundamentally shift between the two? And we can argue this back and forth, but I would actually argue that many of the things we're talking about, route guidance apps, new mobility services, real-time traffic control, I think these are they're making the system more efficient, maybe increasing consumer surplus in some ways, but I think they're reinforcing by and large, the road car attractor. It's making the system more efficient, more attractive, and so even though it is changing our daily lives, I'm not sure it's revolutionary in terms of getting us to something that's fundamentally different in ways that maybe we need. And I think, having said that, I think that the interplay of technology and transportation is, in terms of the working from home phenomena, the hybrid workplace. Again, the fact that none of us had to travel to Boston to hold this seminar. I think information technology is playing a much bigger role in terms of the demand for travel and the role of transportation that is going to play out for some time, and we have to understand better how that's going. And the same thing is playing out, of course, on the urban goods movement side in terms of you don't have to go to the store anymore; the store comes to you. And so again, how's that information technology fundamentally changing travel relationships in terms of goods and services? EVs, will decarbonize, but again, I don't think they're going to change the attractor. And autonomous vehicles, who knows? But I do, sort of harking back to what I've just been saying about working from home, I think the information platforms we have, but also the data we have, just the massive amounts of data we have and AI techniques and so on, are changing our travel behavior. They're also changing our ability as researchers, for example, or planners, to see the city and to understand the city and hopefully maybe control it. So I do think technology, if we use it for good, shall we say, is going to have an impact. So again, and I'm sorry I'm rushing through this, but I guess I'm arguing as opposed to the first two revolutions, which were just completely technology driven and sort of technology acceptance. I think most of the technology that we're talking about, with some of the information technologies aside, aren't really going to change things. They may make it more efficient, but they're not really revolutionary. I mean, but that's not good enough, because our cities are continuing to face massive growth. They have big equity problems. They have big sustainability problems. The business as usual, the current, in particular, the attractor 2, is not a sustainable, is just not sustainable into the future. And so, how do we shift the attractor? And so I would argue we have to start much more seriously shifting it from the land use side. We have to think about how we build the city. Again, as soon as you build that low density suburban residential area, you're hardwiring auto dependency in. So I think, we've talked about the transportation land use interaction for a long, long time. I've been talking about it forever. It's a really hard problem, but I think we have to, and we're not going to change things overnight, but I think we really have to start taking urban design as traffic engineering, shall we say, much more seriously. And I think we have to be leading, if we're going to be breaking the feedbacks or creating more sustainable feedback loops and behaviors. I think we have to take that whole urban design thing much more seriously. And I do think data and information technology will help us. As I say, we can understand the city and how it functions in much better ways. Can we make use of that to actually design cities better? And again, I've been talking about this for a long time, and everybody sort of pats me on the head and says, yes, but we've built the cities this way. It's not going to change overnight, and we can't possibly revolutionize cities. But I think cities are continuing to grow, so we need to take advantage of the growth to grow better. And then we have to look for infill opportunities. The city is a very dynamic place. It's changing all the time. And so I think we have to be agents of change, to be looking for every, in as many ways as possible and in many places as possible, as the city's evolving, changing, growing, whatever, that we're changing it thoughtfully in a direction that's moving us more towards sustainability and not. So Jinhua, I know I've run a little long, but I'll
that's perfect. Thank you so much, Eric. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, before I add my question, I see the Professor Joe Ferreira from MIT is also here. He's also been working on this land use transportation intersection quite a bit. Joe, do you want to add a few remarks? Joe was here, right?
Let me say hi to Joe while we're waiting for him. If he's there, Joe, if you're there, hello. Good.
Hey there, good to see you. I kept clicking unmute and it wouldn't work. I think the gods had an idea about what to do. Thanks for an interesting talk that summarized a lot of sort of what's happened with our thinking about land use and transportation. I totally agree that we need to pay attention to this in a way that recognizes that the urban design and urban planning problems that we have looking forward aren't quite the same as the ones that motivated the initial effort to look at land use and transportation interactions dating back to the 60s and 70s. And I guess just make a few comments on those that I think Eric's done a lot of good work in this direction, but a lot more needs to get done. There's been a long history of the models, but so much of them are focused on sort of auto flow, and autos have indeed greatly expanded access to 2D space compared to transit before that. So understanding how that affects land use and where people choose to live and work is important. But when these models that tried to understand the relationship between land use and transportation sort of grew up, the policy questions were really building a big new highway or building a railroad that took 5 or 10 years, or in the big dig here, even more than that, before they came to fruition. So the question of what you model and how you model is different. And let me just suggest a few ideas about how we need to think a little differently about what to invest in regarding understanding land use and transportation interactions going forward, because the world's a little different. Now you can have a COVID that changes work from home. You can have micro mobility that brings e-scooters in and then takes them away. I saw that happened in Singapore within a year, and bike sharing. So there are ways in which through technology and information technology and sort of physical technology, you can quickly change the way in which people get around. So we need to be a little bit more flexible in modeling what choices people make, why do they go where they go, and how you can get there. And the models aren't anywhere near that nimble. You look at them, and most of the ones that have been applied to a large metro area are proprietary because either the data is private or a lot of the submodels are private. And I think we need to begin to get around that. They tend still to be driven by predicting auto. They don't deal with multimodal very well. They usually don't even include parking. They can include road usage charges, but it's still sort of auto-focused. And I think one of my colleagues here, Andrzej Sedgwick, is trying to do pedestrian flow in sort of main streets, commercial centers within a metro area, and understand what motivates people to go to a place and to traverse it in particular ways as a function of land use. And it's sort of so hard to get the data to be able to do that. And that's understandable because we've had a standardization of the 4-step model for understanding travel demand and work and home location and network flow since the 70s. And a lot of the transportation departments and the funding has sort of standardized the way in which that the data that's needed to do that modeling gets collected and used. And when it comes to tying it into land use, tying it into behavioral changes, we're still largely using the travel demand models that were developed in the 70s. And they don't handle multimodal very well. So I think that needs some work. And in particular, I just say one thing. There's a lot of effort on building digital twins, but they focus on the built environment and understanding where the buildings are and what they'll look like. And they're quite meager in understanding exactly who is going to be on that street, who's going to come there, how heterogeneous is the population that goes to this commercial center versus another commercial center. They're weak on that side, and there aren't public micro data sets that are just the synthetic population as of day X. So as a result, because we don't have shared synthetic population at the level of detail of people in buildings that we need, just a snapshot, then we have a hard time comparing different models and comparing different cities. There's nothing like there is for, say, Netflix, choose the next movie, where you have a data set and people can compare different methods to figure out exactly what's the best algorithm for figuring out what movie you're going to choose next. We need a little bit more of that in this area. And I think it's important because in order to get where we want to go, as Eric's talking about, that's a sort of more sustainable environment in terms of greenhouse gas and the sort of sprawl that comes with too much auto dependence, then we're going to need to do things that are politically difficult with parking costs, road usage charges, and own versus share vehicles. Recognize that in the city where there's high concentration, you're going to have a different model than you are in the suburbs where you don't have the density to make shared use instead of vehicle ownership work. So that suggests there's going to be lots of multimodal travel within metro areas. We really need a serious effort to try and get models that can be improved by comparing one another and doing them with common data sets in order for us to build a better argument of which of these strategies for the 50-minute city or etc. are actually viable. And I think part of the difficulty now is that most of those have some good arguments. You can see the reasoning as to how they might work. But when you say, okay, put it all together and create some model of who's going to go where at metro scale, that's still a long shot. And the only versions that are out there aren't sufficiently testable by the people other than those who made them to be trusted. So I would agree with Eric in terms of what we need to focus on and understanding the direction in which our big metro areas are going to go. in keeping with all these demands for what we have to do to be more sustainable over the next few decades. And I think there are a few things that, at least viewed from academia, we can do to be able to sharpen our arguments in a way that takes into account the changing patterns of how people get around, how they use the new technologies, and the choices that policy can make regarding everything from road usage charges and parking to the way in which we deal with vehicle ownership and multimodal travel, in order to paint some picture that's a little bit more believable about how we can get from where we are to where we want to go.
Right. Thank you, Joe. Erica, do you want to have some quick response to this remark?
Only, as always, I agree with everything Joe says, and I'll just mention that Sunday I'm off to UT Austin, where there's going to be about 30-40 of us gathering together to talk about next generation activity-based modeling, because we all recognize our current models aren't adequate to the task, and that they've been challenged by so many things. Where that leads, I don't know. But yeah, I think in the interest of time, I mean, Joe and I could talk all day about this stuff.
Yeah, thank you, Erica. Yeah, so maybe a few questions from me, and then I'll give it to John for the audience question. The first one is, I'd like to comment a little bit on the international perspective, right? Even though the two technology, cars and public transit, they're mostly generic, right? I mean, the cars in, America, Canada versus China, they're just cars, right? But in terms of what if the role they played, what type of city they really shaped, it very vastly across the different region and different culture in this, right? So why so? What's the other fundamental factor that influence this?
Well, yeah, no, and I agree. And I mentioned, yeah, so I think, I think the differences are, historical and cultural to a certain extent in terms of when the cities developed. But also, I think also some conscious efforts by people, that what sort of city do you want? So, I think if I haven't tried to do this, but if we sort of talk about these two attractors, you could almost create some sort of, spectrum. But you need a few metrics, but you could probably put different cities along the spectrum. And, and again, I think you would see that, most of the certainly, Singapore and Hong Kong and Shanghai and Beijing and so forth. Well, Beijing has a lot of cars, but they would be attractor one cities. I mean, there's still very huge amount of transit, some walkability, very dense mixed use, with then an overlay of, some more modern suburbs. At the other extreme will be the, the Phoenixes and the Houstons and in the U.S. where you don't have much of a downtown, you don't have much of a transit, and it's very auto oriented. I think interestingly, just in that context, I think Canadian cities sit very much between, and then European cities again, I think are much more attractor one, even though there's still suburbs and cars out there. So I think there, if we look around the world, it is almost, as I say, cultural and historical. I'm from Toronto. I think Canadian cities actually sit somewhere in between U.S. cities and European cities in terms of splitting the difference a little bit between the two attractors a bit more. So yeah, so I think and I think there's a lot to be learned. I mean, we. Certainly in Toronto, and I'm sure it's the same in the US, we say, well, let's learn from Asia, let's learn from Europe. And people say, oh, well, no, those are Europeans, those are Asians. What, we're different. We can't, but I think there's an awful lot we could learn from each other in terms of what actually works, and what doesn't work. And I don't think we actually ask that question often enough about particularly, the combination of land use and transportation, looking at holistically.
Right.
Everybody likes to go to Paris, but why don't we build Paris in, Sioux City?
Yeah, good. Thanks. The second question is more on the urban information technology, right? We've been applying this quite a bit, academics, industry. There were times there's a lot of discussion on the smart cities, right? There's a lot of kind of momentum. There were times people excited, including the example actually in Toronto of the Toronto waterfront from Sidewalk Lab. In Japan, we have these woven cities. In China, there's many of these smart city discussion. In India, the whole smart nation movement. In the end of the day, do you see they actually made a difference, or where feel successful where they failed. What's your thought about this smart
Yeah,
nation?
no, I agree. Yeah, it was a thing, right? And so I think that kind of ties into a little bit of what I was saying, like things like traffic control systems. So I don't think there's anything wrong with making the city smarter, and if we can move traffic more efficiently using AI and data, that's good. But that's not going to fundamentally, I guess what I'm trying to say is that's going to not fundamentally change the city structure, and in the long run, it may give you a little more capacity for growth, but it's not going to change things fundamentally. So, and I think that's the thing we see in all of this. It may be where it's working. It is, making your wastewater management a little more efficient, a little more energy efficient, this sort of thing, but it's not fundamentally changing the city. I think it was a tech play by the Ciscos and the IBMs of the world to a certain extent. Whether they made money on it, I'm not sure. But yeah, I don't think they've fundamentally changed the city. And that's not the way to change the city, I think.
Right. We have 12 minutes, so we'll give it to John for the audience question answer. Yeah, please.
Okay, super. Thanks, Jinhua. So Eric, we really did have a super active chat, lots and lots of commentary. So good stuff for you to read afterwards. But just to build a little bit on Jinhua's first question, there's a lot of talk about, so, what's the model that we want to achieve? And I guess as you pointed out, that depends for which population and for whom. But is there a kind of single or a couple of cities that you could point to in different places around the world that you say, this is where we want to go?
Yeah, again, I don't think there's one model. I mean, on my first slide or so, I had Kevin Lynch, an MIT professor, and he wrote a book on good urban form, and I think he was trying to answer that question: what's a good city, and how would we know it when we get there? And I think at the end of the book, he sort of concluded, well, he almost failed because it's too complicated. I had a grad student when we were first building iLoot, and he said, so if we could optimize a city, how would we know when we get there? How would we know when we got the good city? But so it's going to vary, So I think, so the solution in China or India is not the same solution as in Europe or North America, even though they share certain. I think it's criteria. I think you have to be asking the question: how equitable is the city? What's its carbon footprint? How much land is it consuming? Sort of an ecological approach to things. What's its footprint? Does it, how efficient is it functioning? And there's different ways of answering that question. I think in kind of, shall we say, the North American European context, I'm a big fan of, a number of the European cities, Munich, Amsterdam. Munich is a big city, fairly similar to Toronto, much better transit, much more efficient. People still have their, they have their BMW that they use to get out on the weekend, but it's a very different combination. And it's not, they don't have super high-rise buildings necessarily. When we talk about density, everybody thinks it has to be 70-story towers. It doesn't. So I think there is much that, let's say, us in North America can learn from, particularly Europe, because that is probably culturally closest to us.
Indeed. Okay, fair enough. So very early on, John Morgan asked, I think, quite an interesting question, because it's about the built environment. So he asked, in the mid-20th century, we retrofitted existing cities to accommodate cars. Today, many of us are trying to retrofit car-based cities and suburbs to center pedestrians and transit. So what are the similarities and differences between those two efforts to reorganize cities?
Yeah, well, I think, I sometimes say it took us about 100 years to build the auto-centric city. It may take us 100 years to unbuild it. I think one difference is a lot of that retrofitting was actually greenfield growth. It was really expansion, suburbs, right? So that's easy. It's easy to take the farmer field and plop a bunch of houses down. We now are much more in a retrofitting. It's infill, and there's people in place who maybe like their suburban houses. So I do think it has to be the strategy the strategic goal is more walkability, more transit, more complete communities. The tactics, I think, however, have to be very local, very targeted. Old suburban malls, for example, are prime candidates for, repurposing, and they're actually pretty cheap to repurpose. Almost street by street, community by community, look for places where you could change the zoning. A simple thing like maybe changing zoning so you could actually have a neighborhood corner store, milk store, which in most suburbs you can't. I live in a traditional walkable neighborhood in Toronto where, there's a coffee shop on the corner, there's a grocery, there's a little corner store. It's mixed use by design. And, most of our suburbs are single use by fiat. So I think we have to think about how you gradually and look for opportunities, and then it grows. I mean, if you can have, you build you have an opportunity here, so you do something, and then maybe it's even a few kilometers away, you have something, but gradually these things will grow together. So it's, cities are organic, and we don't do it overnight, but let's, you start wherever you can, and I think that's the only way.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. It was pretty easy to put up the strip mall when it was just bare land, but it's a little bit tougher to sort of undo that urban fabric. Let me just skip forward a little bit. There's an interesting question and comment from Elon Elgar, where he says, look, I actually somewhat disagree. And here's what he's saying. He's saying, okay, cities are complex systems, right? And all complex systems suffer from the law of unintended consequences. And he's sort of asking, are there examples where urban planners might have executed a policy or some sort of program that they expected would have result A, and in fact, in the end, it had result B. Any comments or thoughts about this law of unintended consequences?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, Elon is my former student, so, and he always asks the tough questions. So, hi, Elon. Thanks. I agree completely. And in fact, when I'm talking about these things, I am worried because planners really haven't had much success over the last couple of centuries. People want to build utopian communities, and I think it's very hard to plan and have things turn out the way you want, and there will always be unintended consequences. So I think that's why, again, maybe more incremental approaches, so we can fail once in a while, will be helpful. But I guess I just feel, again, I think the status quo, the business as usual, just will not continue to work. And so we do have to try to change the trend curve somehow. Will we make mistakes? Yes. I think one of the big challenges is how do we bring the people along? I mean, a lot of opposition to a lot of things are people do not see how it will be better. They think change will make things worse. So it is risk. I mean, if we're going to change things, there's always risk, but there's also huge risk of the status quo. And I think as human beings, we always overestimate the risk of change and underestimate the risk of the status quo. And that's, and so what I'm trying to talk about is, well, how do we shift that? How do we reduce risk and find better paths into the future? And again, I came back, previous question about, I think it's about criteria, it's about goals, different mechanisms will get there. And I don't think it'd be, Stalinist top down, imposing structures on things. That doesn't work.
Okay. Maybe a two-part question around the concept of the 15-minute city, which as you rightly pointed out, this is not a particularly novel concept. People have been thinking about this for many years. But if the concept is that you want people to more or less live in communities where they have simple access to the things they need, education for their children, basic healthcare, groceries, and so forth, and you want to sort of minimize that. The first part of the question is, what about the concept of work? So some people have said, wait, hold on, do we really want people to work where they live? do you have an opinion about, in terms of the concept of the social fabric of cities that you articulated in the beginning of your talk, where it's about these kind of spontaneous and dynamic interactions? Do you have a sense of that? Like, do we want people to actually work close to where they live in this traditional pre-COVID notion of, working and commuting?
I would say no. I mean, people have been talking about self-containment of communities going back to the 60s. I mean, it's not possible to achieve. And I don't think it's desirable. And I think this is one of the things that, the 15-minute community misses. And, I'll stick my head out, bicycle lobbyists and so forth. The city is a big place, and you want people to be able to interact from one side of the city to the other. And so we do need mass transit to do that. We do need cars and highways still to do this, I think. That synergy of the city requires all sorts of interactions. You will never get a hermetically sealed neighborhood where everybody lives and works. Well, we could go back to medieval times where you're in the village, right? Do we really want that? That was not a productive model. We don't want that. I mean, again, as I say, I live in a really nice traditional neighborhood. It is the closest thing Toronto has to a 15-minute, it's not 15-minute, 20, 30-minute community. But we're out of it all the time, I mean, and you're out and about, and you want, and I think walkable communities, neo-traditional communities, I think the people have been thoughtful about recognize, well, yes, there's lots of things we'll be able to do. You could go to the neighborhood pub in the evening one night, but then you go downtown to the nice restaurant the next night, and you may work from home one day, but then you still have an office, so I think the fabric of the city has to be maintained much more over wider distances. And so, I think, these complete communities, whatever we call it, help. But and they're as much about quality of life as they are about sustainability, I think. I mean, we did, sorry, probably running long here, but a long time ago, we did an econometric study where we actually tried to look at, micro neighborhood design impacts on greenhouse gas, basically automobile usage, versus macro things about where is this community versus employment and all that sort of thing. And we were able to show that, the neighborhood design made a difference. But the macro factors of sort of how you organize the city, where are the jobs, where are the people, how do they connect one another, is far more important from something like vehicle kilometers traveled and greenhouse gases. So both are important, but not, the notion that we solve everything by turning everything into a 15-minute community, even if that was possible, is just not going to happen.
So I will just say Robert Severo, who joined this forum about 2 years ago, I think had a very similar perspective. I think we're out of time. I'll turn it back to you, Jinhua.
That's right. Thank you, John. Sorry to cut this such a warm conversation and discussion there. Both in this our conversation, but also in chat, there's so many interesting discussion that Erica will collect, compile them, share with you. So please, everyone, join me. Thank Professor Erica Miller for the presentation and conversation.
Well, thank you very much again. Thank you so much for having me. Hope it's been interesting. I've had fun.